Economic freedom leads to economic prosperity. This has been a principle which has been shown to be true throughout history. Economic freedom being the primary driver of capitalism, which spurned the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s and the Digital Revolution of the 1900s. Economic freedom has been shown to be true by numerous economists such as Henry Hazlitt and Thomas Sowell, who've written entire books showing how economic freedom always boosts an economy. The principles which these economists talk about in their books, and the principle which has been shown true by history is this: whenever the free market is truly free, whenever the people are the ones who decide what they want to buy, and businesses are the ones who decide what they want to sell, that is the economy where you're going to have the goods which are produced at the highest quality and at the lowest possible price. The Renewable Fuel Standard violates this fundamental principle. Not only does it increase the costs for consumers, but it also violates this idea of freedom upon which our country was founded. And it takes this freedom out of the hands of the people and puts it in the hands of the federal government. And I believe that this is not only harmful, but it's a contradiction of our fundamental principles. In this speech, I'm going to go over the logic of the negative team and ultimately show how the Renewable Fuel Standard is harmful to our economy and how it's universally agreed upon by all of the evidence so far in this debate round. So first, I'd like to address the goal of the negative. They said that their goal is net benefits. And my simple response to this is that there is a net benefit. We can see this from our justification 1 and 2, where actually on net, people lost $76.7 billion because of the Renewable Fuel Standard. Now I'm going to address later why the Renewable Fuel Standard is bad, but simply that alone shows how the Renewable Fuel Standard is harmful to the United States. The first solvency point of the negative is that production would be unaffected. Now, I have a couple responses to this. My first response is that this is actually a contradiction. The negative team presented 2 points in their last speech. The first was the solvency point, and the second was a disadvantage about economic loss. The problem is, these 2 different points are in direct contradiction to each other. If production won't be affected by our policy, then there will be no economic loss. And if there is economic loss, then actually production is going to be affected. So really, the negative team has already contradicted themselves in their first speech. But my second response to this is that actually production will be affected, but it will be to the betterment of the American people. According to Nicholas Lorst, an economist who focuses on energy and the environment, he said in February 9 of 2017, quote, "A study by the University of Tennessee Institute for Agriculture estimated that with no RFS and no ethanol tax credit, demand for corn ethanol would be 4.3 billion gallons in 2014, or about 30% of actual corn ethanol production that year." End quote. So what we see from this piece of evidence is that we fulfilled this first solvency point of the negative. There will be a decrease in ethanol production, and so we will have better gas mileage, and our food prices will be lower as a result, going back to our justifications. So we see that actually production will be affected. And also, the next point, talking about how mandates are important for the early stages of production, is false as well. My question that I would ask to the negative team about this point is, how long do we have to wait before an industry is no longer in its early stages? We have had the Renewable Fuel Standard in effect for 14 years, since I was 3 years old, and still we have seen that it's failed on every single front. It's failed to help our energy security, it's failed to improve the environment, and it's definitely failed to improve the economy. How long do we have to wait before this industry is no longer in its early stages? That's the question that I would ask to the negative. The one disadvantage that the negative team presented is that there would be an economic loss. My simple response to this is that actually it's the exact opposite. The Renewable Fuel Standard is the thing which is causing economic loss in America today. When we look at the economy and we look at the effects of the Renewable Fuel Standard, it's very tempting to focus in on one specific industry, and such as farmers, who definitely benefit from the Renewable Fuel Standard. We can say that obviously farmers are benefited from this because it's basically mandated that we buy their products. But when we look at the effects of a certain policy on the economy, we can't just narrow in on one industry. We have to look at all the industries that are involved in this policy. We have to take the principle that Henry Hazlitt talks about in his book, Basic Economics. Quote, "The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups." End quote. So that's what I'm going to try to do right now. I'm going to try to show how, while it may be beneficial, the Renewable Fuel Standard, for certain industries, it definitely does hurt other industries as well. The first industry harmed by the RFS is the rural industries. According to Nicholas Loris, again, quote, proponents of the RFS and biofuel subsidies argue that policies support economic growth in rural communities. Actually, the policies support corn growers at the expense of other rural industries, such as livestock production, which use corn as animal feed, end quote. So what we see here is that, yes, it may support some industries, but it's at the consequence of others. Now, the second main industry that is hurt, and I think this is more significant than the first, is the domestic oil industry. According to Philip Rossetti, the former director of energy policy at the American Action Forum, he said on April 19 of 2018, quote, the RFS is indifferent to the source of oil that it supplants. Since more oil is produced domestically than imported net, the RFS is more likely to replace a domestic oil source than a foreign one, end quote. What this piece of evidence shows is that whenever the RFS artificially increases demand for ethanol, it decreases demand for the domestic oil. This hurts the domestic oil industry. We can see specifically how it hurts the domestic oil industry by another piece of evidence by Philip Rossetti, showing how a Philadelphia refinery went bankrupt because of the RFS. Quote, a Philadelphia-based oil refinery filed for bankruptcy in January of 2018 and pinned blame for its failings on the renewable fuel standard, end quote. The renewable fuel standard is harmful to the economy. It may help some, but it's at the expense of others. Now, next I'd like to address the two justifications that I talked about, or my partner talked about in his last speech. Actually, the first thing I'd like to talk about is how the negative team didn't actually respond to these. They didn't refute our two studies under our second justification, showing how the renewable fuel standard increases the cost of gas by a significant percentage point. Or increases the cost of food. They haven't really responded to our other evidence talking about how the renewable fuel standard increases the cost of gas too. But I'd like to just stress that these justifications further show how the renewable fuel standard is harmful to the US economy. We see that the renewable fuel standard increases the cost of gas because ethanol decreases gas mileage for motorists. Yes, it may be true that the gas price at the pump may be lower, but this is deceiving because the same amount of money that you'd use to drive that car 10 miles is not going to actually get you the same distance. So really what the problem with the renewable fuel standard is it drastically hurts the economy. Our second justification is that it increases the cost of food. And according to a piece of evidence by Nicholas Loris, economists universally agree on this point. Quote, a study by the University of Tennessee Institute for Agriculture estimated that with I believe this is the piece of evidence I just read. But I have some more evidence back at the table talking about how economists universally agree that this is the case. So in conclusion, the renewable fuel standard harms economic freedom. And when you harm economic freedom, you're going to harm your economy. This is exactly what we've seen in the current system, and that is why I believe we should abolish the renewable fuel standard. Thank you.